Hobsbawm, in his work The Age of Empire, relates a quote from Pierre Nora that memory is life. It is always carried by groups of living people, and therefore it is in permanent evolution. On another part, he writes, history is the always incomplete and problematic reconstruction of what is no longer there. Memory always belongs to our time and forms a lived bond with the eternal present. History is a representation of the past. This highlights fundamentally what I think are a few key issues with the study of history that often arise. Of course, much of my channel is dedicated to studying history, and I absolutely love studying history. History is important for us to study because those who don't learn from it are doomed to repeat it. Yet, inevitably, like with all other disciplines of study and all other human endeavors and projects, the study of history ultimately does fall into a certain number of issues and problems. The biggest issue with history is that we have to look back in the past and try and reconstruct a narrative of the events that transpired. Now, there's an issue that often arises with this. Sometimes the collective memory of a people's or certain individuals may back project what they think the past was like or what they think transpired onto the past, and they read in their own biases into the past, and so they often present a picture of the past which isn't fully accurate. And this kind of back projecting often does happen. There's also the other aspect or the other part or the opposite thing that might happen where people may purposefully misrepresent the past, or people may purposefully misinterpret the past or past events because they may not like a certain individual or a certain group, and so they want to present that history in a malicious and bad manner. There's also the issues of evidence, because a lot of the times the historical evidence we have at best in many cases might be kind of flimsy. At worst they might be outright fabrications, and oftentimes you may think that, well, we can just separate the authentic from the weak, let's say. But the issue that often arises is that with historical reports, in many cases we are fundamentally relying on apocryphal and sometimes not very strong pieces of evidence, or not very strong links between the past and the present. And so, in many cases, our historical narratives have to oftentimes be based on evidence which, at best, is just half decent, or at worst, can be quite flimsy. The job of the historian, then, of course, is to try and construct a narrative from all the available evidence. Yet, inevitably, a lot of these human biases and a lot of these very human things come into the play, and it's very easy then to miswrite things or misinterpret things. Of course, there's famous quotes such as history is written by the victors, and that is definitely true to an extent. However, we also do have to account for the fact that history, in many cases, the history of the oppressed is also preserved. The history of marginalized groups, let's say, or the history of the other quote unquote side is oftentimes also present. But what happens is the history of the victor, let's say, let's just call him the victor, the history of the victor is often the one which is the most mainstream or the most famous, or it's the most apparent sort of historical narrative that is present in our societies. And so, oftentimes, those who try to present alternative historical narratives get shunned to the side or ostracized. And ultimately, history is really an attempt to construct a narrative of the past, of humanity. And whilst constructing any narrative, there are ultimately issues that one may fall into, and there are ultimately going to be inaccuracies that do occur. Ultimately, history is our best attempt to understand the past. It's not perfect, it's not infallible, we can get things wrong. It's up to future generations to correct us on things we get wrong. But at the very least, the least that we can do perhaps is to limit our own biases and to try and understand history as objectively as we can based on evidence, and try and consider the different historical narratives that we have. And at the end of the day, the most important thing with the study of history is that we are studying the broader and complete human legacy. We are studying the legacy of countless of living beings who worked, who toiled for their future generations to exist. And so ultimately, history, for all its faults, should give us an appreciation for humanity and the human condition and human existence in general.